Now I should get down and introduce our guest speaker. This is Jim Garrison. I got that right? I keep mixing Jim and John up. Parents should not do that. Make them both J's. It's tough. He and his brother were at the Episcopal Academy, and when the Yorkland which was part of Episcopal Academy, got torn down, they were making their decisions about what to do in life. And it was, for Jim, apparently, a choice between engineering, history, and architecture. And by running through the building and taking pictures and gathering artifacts and pieces of the building that they could carry away, he stayed away from the engineering part and went to history and architecture. He's worked for a number of firms around the area, which I'm not going to bother to list. If you want to, you can look up his CV yourself. But we're very pleased to have him, and I'm interested in what he has to say about Will Price's architectural mind bent before he hit Rose Valley. Jim?
Thank you, Sue. Yeah, I feel like I've been a partner with Will Price for my entire career in architectural education, architecture, and even now, sort of after it, in a corporate position. But I think what I'm going to be offering today is a slightly different narrative on Will Price, and I feel like it's because I've lived with him now for 40 years that I'm in a position to do that. So I think you'll probably be hearing some things today that are a little new and different, I hope, and that it'll really enrich the dialogue around a person who I think remains sort of enigmatic to a lot of people, to square certain things about his life, his career, his interests, the breadth of what he accomplished during his career, to try to find out where that came from. And I think a lot of the answer to that lies in the decade between 1890 and 1900, because that was the crossroads of his career. So with that, I'll get started. Architectural design blends artistic vision with problem solving and knowledge of building technology. Success as an architect is a result of balancing these different disciplines. Architecture is not an individual pursuit. Like it or not, there have to be clients and builders to make a complete work. The architect might be an individual or a firm with multiple contributors. Unbuilt architecture, by definition, is incomplete. These definitions of architect and completed work are important in evaluating the works of architects because it is too tempting to think of the solitary genius rather than the team player. It is also tempting to use conventional historical or art history analyses to try to uncover influences and outcomes. It can be a mistake to place a person in some sort of chronology that assumes a passing down of some sort of architectural DNA from generation to generation. There is a progression, and the ideas are passed down through different means, but the spark of inspiration can come from many different sources. This story begins with Richard Morris Hunt, born in Vermont in 1827, who was the first American to study architecture at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Before that, architecture in America was typically practiced by persons who either came up through the ranks of carpenters or master builders, or a more formal apprenticeship from someone who had learned and practiced abroad. There were guilds like the Carpenters Company in Philadelphia, but no institutions of higher learning with a formal curriculum for architecture until several years after the Civil War. The École itself was a rather new institution being organized in 1819 from the former Royal Academy in France. It had a rigorous program that combined artistic and engineering disciplines in a system that valued clarity and exceptional presentation skills. With family support, Hunt was able to prepare for several years to take the entrance exams to the École, and he began his studies there in 1846, staying for 4 or 5 years, the typical length of term at that time. Armed with a diploma and the experience on working in monumental buildings in France, Hunt returned to the United States in 1855 and opened a studio and then an office in New York. He had some work, but he also accepted an offer from Thomas U. Walter to assist with the design of the U.S. Capitol in Washington, where they were adding the wings for the House and Senate. On his way back to New York, he stopped in Philadelphia to see William Furness, the artist and older brother of Frank Furness, who was then 16 years old. Hunt made a big impression on Frank, and the feeling may have been mutual because Furness went to New York 3 years later to join Hunt's studio, the most prestigious place to study in the country. By that time, Hunt had become a leader in the profession of architecture, having won a suit that established the rights to own his own work and to collect the fees for that work. He was a founding member of the American Institute of Architects and was soon known as the dean of the profession. Hunt maintained his studio at 10th Street with an office uptown where students rarely ventured. When Hunt dissolved the studio in 1860 and sojourned to Newport with his artist brother William, Furness and several others joined him there, where they were exposed to the artistic training from Richard's brother William. After a few months, Hunt extended his stay and sent Frank back to New York to manage the projects on the boards, including the Griswold House in Newport. The Griswold House is in the lower left-hand corner there. It was completed in 1861. By the spring of 1861, everything had changed with the beginning of the Civil War and Furness joining the Army. That same year, William Price was born to James and Sarah Price in Wallingford, Pennsylvania. As the war raged on and Furness won the Medal of Honor for valor on the battlefield, other Americans left the country for a more peaceful study abroad. H.H. Richardson, Charles McKim from Chester County, and Stanford White from New York all went to the École as part of the next wave. McKim, Mead, and White would form one of the first nationally prominent firms with commissions throughout the country. Like Hunt, a lot of their important early work consisted of residences in New York and Newport. When Furness ended his military service in 1864, he returned to New York and played a leading role in Hunt's office rather than going to France to complete his own studies. He must have been a prodigy to have been placed in such a high position, and no doubt his professional skills were matched by the leadership abilities he had gained during the war. After 2 years, when it became clear that Hunt would always be the leader of the firm, Furness came back to Philadelphia. He married and began the arduous process of building a practice through family connections and partnerships with others who could assist in bringing in work. His breakout opportunity was winning the competition for the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in 1871. His work still showed the influence of his years with Hunt and its composition and its use of historical precedents. But strong personal traits were blossoming also, particularly in the banks and commercial architecture. His early residential architecture owed much to Hunt, especially the suburban residences, which were deeply influenced by his work with Hunt in Newport. Dolobran, which you can see in this slide, began as a small summer cottage for Clement Griscom in Haverford in 1881, and it grew to enormous size with multiple additions up until 1895. With each addition, Furness remained cognizant of the overall composition as he added wings and towers and reorganized the remaining features on the principal facades. Furness had achieved considerable success in his suburban work and was greatly aided by bringing in Alan Evans as a partner in 1881, acknowledging the contributions that Evans had made over the previous decade in helping to bring work to the firm. Furness and Evans were responsible for a number of large and small houses along the main line during the 1880s and after. British architecture had always strongly influenced America, and in the late 19th century, these forces were stronger than ever as architectural periodicals allowed for the rapid dissemination of visual material through advances in publishing photographs and other drawings. The castellated architecture of Scotland was particularly popular as it was both picturesque and bespoke of heritage and ancestry. A seaside house in St. Andrews, in the upper left, is virtually indistinguishable from three houses on the main line. Maybrook by the Hewitt brothers was begun in 1881 and still stands in Wynwood. William Hewitt had been a partner of Furness in the 1870s. Theophilus Parsons Chandler was born in Boston in 1845 to an old New England family and studied at the École des Beaux-Arts. He married Sophie DuPont and established a practice in Philadelphia where he designed many large houses and churches. Dunmanning in Newtown Square, lower left, and Restover and Haverford are both gone, but they show variations on the Scottish and English themes. Chandler's other major contribution was taking an informal program for architecture at Penn and founding the School of Architecture there in 1890. Addison Hutton was another of the senior practitioners who had risen from the building trades to a successful architectural practice with strong connections to the conservative Quaker families who were benefiting from the economic expansions after the war. Ballet Tour for Isaac Hallowell Clothier I was designed in 1885 as a restrained example of the Scottish baronial, with just a few basic elements enlivening the rectangular geometry. The crow-step gables, the stylized porte-cochere, and the dominant tower with a conical tower were basically additions to a fairly basic scheme. Deepdale, the residence for Israel Morris, completed just a few years later, is also a cubic mansarded mess with some decorative embellishments on the two principal facades. Both houses had a slightly behind-the-times feel and a few flourishes that could not overcome that feeling, that was largely overlooked. Let's skip the page here. That was largely overlooked by other firms in Philadelphia. The Philadelphia chapter of the American Institute of Architects was founded in 1869 by the established practitioners. Without formal licensure, chapter membership represented a level of recognition of a set of skills that differentiated architects from builders. The chapter worked on professionalizing practice through formal contract language, fee schedules, and administering design competitions. In 1883, a group of younger practitioners that included Frank and later his brother Will Price formed the T-Square Club to promote the study and practice of architecture and the kindred arts and to afford its members opportunities for friendly competition in design and to further appreciation of the architect by the public. While this sounds a lot like the AIA, it was more social and more focused on design. The annual exhibitions displayed the work of the local members, students, and others, selected in a juried submission process. The camaraderie provided a support network for the young firms and those at larger firms looking for a wider creative outlet than might have been available in their position. The greatest opportunity area for young architects would be the burgeoning area of practice, speculative buildings for the new railroad suburbs. Although pattern books and builder's guides had existed for a long time, Single-family detached houses were rarely built on speculation for a number of reasons, the foremost being the difficulty of the prospective owners finding the money to build. The combination of a new managerial class who could live some distance from the workplace using railroads for commuting created a demand that was answered by developers working with banks, financiers, and the railroads to create planned residential communities. After tentative beginnings before the Civil War, the post-war boom in the North and the Midwest provided the opportunity for young architects to work with builders and developers. Pattern books such as Shupple's catalog from 1890 were a guide and inspiration, but architects could respond to local market conditions and could also add embellishments that would help to market this new building type. In Philadelphia, the development of rail lines out through Germantown was followed by the main line and Chestnut Hill. In some cases, the railroads owned excess land adjacent to their rights-of-way, and in other cases, developers allied with banks purchased the cheap, worn-out farmland close to the city. Railroads and streetcar suburbs developed in radial spokes from the city center. The railroad suburbs were at the top. They boasted paved streets and sidewalks, water and sewer. Later, electricity and telephone service made them very modern places. The hundreds of houses, many built on spec, others as custom homes with specific clients in mind, were a huge design opportunity that was largely overlooked by the more established firms that had larger commissions in the city and outside of these developments. The firms doing this developer work were young, with principals between the ages of 20 and 25. It was quite a responsibility, but also an arena to develop design expertise and a foothold in the profession. Frank Price and his younger brother Will each began their working careers as carpenters. Frank entered the office of Frank Furness in 1876 while also involved with Herman Wendell in a construction company. Wendell was able to acquire some large projects for housing developments in North Philadelphia through Henry Diston. Using the proceeds of this work and entering a new partnership with Walter B. Smith, the new company joined forces with the banker Anthony Drexel and newspaperman George Childs. Together, this team developed the 600-acre Wayne estate on the main line beginning in 1881, and it proceeded for the next 20 years. That same year, Frank and Will Price started a partnership and soon became the preferred architectural firm of Wendell and Smith and Drexel and Childs. While Wayne was hitting its peak in the 1890s, Wendell and Smith began the development of Overbrook Farms, using the same architectural firms to design a vast array of single-family and twin residences on a former farm on the edge of Philadelphia. Like Wayne, the main line of the Pennsylvania Railroad bisected that development, and the train stations were the vital connection to the city for the residents. The house designs by the Price brothers followed many of the conventions of the day and related to the shingle style that was popular in the Northeast. There were some noticeable differences, particularly in the lack of colonial revival motifs and some interesting approaches to composing the masses of the buildings, which departed from the basic gabled rectangles. While not overtly borrowing from Furness and Evans, the aggressive forms of the Wayne houses by the Price brothers probably owe something to things that they did learn in that office. A young architect working in Furness's office, though, had a very different experience than Furness had had in Hunt's office. The workload in Furness's office did not allow time for study or formal development. Instead, the young apprentices started by tracing drawings in the age before blueprinting. It was learning by doing and precious little time for theory. At the time when just a few sheets of drawings might be required to get something built, it was an effective way to join the profession where one could become more independent, based solely on raw talent. Will seems to have been the principal renderer, and the drawings have a touch of whimsy and a fetching quality that would appeal to developers and potential customers. Their designs were a far cry from the more conservative approach of fellow Quaker Addison Hutton. While the colonial revival would soon become the national style, it is interesting that it was rare in Wayne and only found in a few examples in Overbrook Farms. One possible explanation is that the colonial revival actually did not seem progressive enough or as marketable as the more whimsical designs of the Price brothers. In the midst of their work for Wendell and Smith, the Price firm received its big break in 1892 when they won the commission for Woodmont, the country estate of the recently retired owner of the Ellenwood Steel Company. The project was a great leap forward for Will, who had superseded his brother as the leader of the firm. Even with the architectural pyrotechnics still coming from the office of Furness and Evans, there was nothing like this house in Philadelphia or anywhere else. With this project, however, Hunt comes back into the picture. Here's Woodmont, Biltmore, going up in Asheville at about the same time, but with some noticeable difference. Was this where Price got his inspiration? Or was this? I think there is a very strong case for the latter, and I'll begin that discussion now. So get ready to revise the National Historic Landmark designation. It has been written that Biltmore, Hunt's massive chateau for George Washington Vanderbilt in Asheville, North Carolina, was a direct inspiration for Woodmont. While there's some evidence that Price was aware of the building, it is more likely that the great opportunity finally allowed Will Price to create the palace of his dreams. Rejoining the story of Hunt's development since the 1870s shows some similarities, but also some important differences in what they each brought to architecture. There's a strong case to be made that the principal inspiration was Will's own imagination, more like the way Furness composed his buildings. Woodmont has more than a touch of fantasy in its forms and setting. Price's training and work methods were very different from Hunt's, and that shows in his work. The outermost trappings of the historically inspired detailing of Woodmont would have been available from many sources. By New York standards, Vanderbilt money was new, and it was quite a statement for the 29-year-old William K. Vanderbilt to commission this limestone chateau amidst the stylish brownstone townhomes just south of the recently opened Central Park. Hunt was the natural choice for these new showpieces, as his training in Paris imparted a degree of legitimacy to this new expression of historically inspired architecture. When the house at 5th Avenue and 52nd Street was completed in 1883, it ushered in a wave of imitation for the new industrial and banking barons across the country. William Kay's younger brother George was also coming into his inheritance and had to make a choice on where to build his country home. Because his health had been somewhat fragile, he had been looking at areas away from the cities with more beneficial climates. Rejecting New England and the Middle Atlantic coast, he settled on the growing town of Asheville, North Carolina, on the edge of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The railroads were just starting to serve the timber and other commercial interests in the area, and real estate speculators were eager to build on the tourist and resident trade. Battery Park Hotel, built in 1885 from the designs of the Philadelphia firm Hazelhurst and Huckle, was the first new resort building in Asheville. Stylistically, it was related to the buildings of that type being built all over the country by the railroads to build passenger service to supplement their freight hauling. In many ways, these resort hotels were merely agglomerations of the smaller residential designs being developed for the suburban housing that was also part of this railroad development strategy. While George Washington Vanderbilt was scouting the area in North Carolina and buying what would become the 200,000 acres of land, the Battery Park was his base of operations. The design of Biltmore began in 1888 with a relatively modest colonial revival scheme, transitioning to something more old world in the next version in early 1889. There's no specific documentation describing why the building kept growing and what caused the changes in style. Later in 1889, it had assumed the form based on French precedents. As Hunt continued to refine his large residential architecture, his references to specific prototypes became more prevalent. In the case of Biltmore, the central entrance tower and signature stair tower came from different parts of the Louis XIII courtyard at the Royal Palace of Blois. Hunt showed his mastery at working with these specific precedents into a new, unified composition following the precepts of his training in Paris. The design was basically finalized in 1899, as these drawings attest. By this time, Biltmore had become the largest house to be constructed in the United States by a good margin, and it had assumed a level of notoriety. Given the size of the building and its remoteness, construction took another 5 years, being complete for a Christmas celebration in 1895, by which time Hunt had recently died and Woodmont had been completed well over a year before. Construction photos from 1893 and 1894 show the slow progress, even though there were hundreds of workers and a dedicated railroad line straight to the front door of the building. The presence of Biltmore suggested that Asheville could become a significant resort area, so Vanderbilt and some others commissioned another hotel, the Kenilworth, in 1890. Developer and railroad connections might have helped steer this commission to the Price brothers. It was their largest work to date. Despite the elegance of Will's rendering, the design lacks the cohesiveness that would be shown in the designs of some of the more experienced peers. It is not difficult to see it as the collage of their various house designs for Wendell and Smith, with a few large elements to help try to tie it together. As built, it also shows some of the perils of working from a distance with developers. Only the left 2/3 of the building depicted in the rendering was actually built, and a number of the details were simplified. It thus becomes a little difficult to judge it as a finished work. It also suggests that Price would have had little time in Asheville, but probably did see a model of Biltmore and maybe some of the construction drawings, but not the actual building in any advanced state of construction. All right. This is a little tricky. We've got an animation we're going to try to run.
Okay. Let's see if I can.
There we go. Here is Woodmont modeled in AutoCAD to try to look at how the building was designed and put together. You can see that there are a lot of different forms, shapes, a lot of things going on with this building. You know, this was Price's first big chance to do something, and I think he threw every trick at the book at this commission. I think it was certainly a very different way to approach a design project than what Hunt would have done by pulling out his travel photos from France. By any standards, Woodmont is an original composition. Although it does stretch across a ridgeline overlooking the Schuylkill River and the Ellenwood Steelworks in Conshohocken, It still has a compact mass emphasized by a pyramidal grouping of roof forms. It is grounded by an oversized porte cochere jutting out from the center of the main mass to mark the entrance to the house. An octagonal study with its own steeply peaked roof terminates the westward side of the building. The west side uses this shape and a pair of massive chimneys to provide a dramatic cutoff to the various towers and gables that mark the other facades. The rear side, which faces the river, has a large circular piazza under a shallow conical roof. In contrast to the front of the house, which is meant to make a full impression across an expansive lawn, the rear is more episodic as it perches on the edge of the precipice above the river. The expressway was 60 years in the future. While the extreme composition uses many different shapes and masses, the decorative details are actually well developed and show a close reading of precedents and an accurate rendition in stone. The detailed drawings here, published in an 1894 edition of the Architectural Review, are a match for anything coming out of Hunt's or anyone else's office. It shows that the Price office had developed skills in adapting historical detailing for their own work. Will Price by this time was operating independently from his brother Frank and spent a large amount of time on the site of Woodmont, living in a pre-existing outbuilding. The house was completed in 1894, a year before Biltmore. It was also documented that much of the interior fit-out was contracted to decorating firms, a common practice in that day when the design architect might only leave raw brick ready for full interiors to come in from either Europe or some other place. The Architectural Review drawings include designs for the hall fireplace and dining room, and Price's rising interest in medieval decorative forms is clear in the Great Hall and the fireplace. The central interior space is the key to the entire house plan and is closely related to the living halls that were the prime organizing elements of this smaller suburban house plans. Other living spaces, like the master suite, were fit out to reflect the most current styles and functional elements of the day. Woodmont also, as built, had a telephone, and the telephone number was 3. Woodmont was one of the earliest examples of Price's architecture to specifically reference forms and decorative motifs from European architecture. Woodmont opened the door to more large residential commissions where Price explores the use of precedents in work that is more historicizing than his previous residential developer work. The E.L. Farr residence in Winona, New Jersey was completed in 1897 and is an essay in what Will called the Old French style. And it's similar to the small manor houses of Normandy that were beginning to be published at the time. He had only visited Europe for the first time the year before, where he could see and sketch the vernacular architecture of the countryside. The Farr House is an example of a conventional plan enlivened by fine decorative flourishes. It is a beautifully detailed, well-executed house. Since the 18th century, Philadelphia had always been the center for publishing for popular periodicals as well as newspapers and books. The new suburban housing was a mainstay of what would later become known as shelter magazines. Members of the T-Square Club were well represented in these publications. One of the more influential magazines, House and Garden, started in Philadelphia right at the turn of the century. Ladies' Home Journal, under the publisher Edward Bach, might have A House for a Prairie, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, sharing space in the same issue with the latest in the colonial revival movement. Bach himself commissioned Price for his own house in Marion, and here we see the 1897 residence near the Marion Park, also rendered in that Northern European precedent. The color publishing that was also becoming prevalent at the time allowed information from the prototypes to come directly to the offices in this country without the time and expense of the multi-month European sojourns that had previously been part of an architect's yearly practice. The 1901 Lewis Clark House in Bryn Mawr is one of the most completely developed and best preserved houses of this style type. Lewis and his brother John owned the autocar manufacturing company in Ardmore. It was one of the most innovative manufacturing firms in the nation at that time. John's house in Bryn Mawr had been designed by Frank Furness in the 1880s and later modified by the Price brothers. The house for Lewis was large but not lavish. The interior plan held on to the traditional elements of the living hall with a fireplace, ingle nook, and a compact plan where each room was well defined but also part of an overall flow of space throughout the building. The ceiling articulation was important in defining the spaces through patterns of beams and curved shapes that gave some distinction to each volume without necessarily walling off one space from another. By the turn of the century, Price had developed some sophisticated decorative schemes based on his own personal interpretations of Gothic revival details being published by Viollet-le-Duc and others who were rebuilding and restoring buildings in France. These decorative schemes encompass many of the arts, including glass and mural painting, and dovetailed with the arts and crafts movements in Europe and North America. There is definitely a unity in the forms and designs of the leaded glass, the woodwork, and the other decorative work in this house. The forms inspired by the romanticized view of the Middle Ages appear in much of the work of the Rose Valley shops. In 1893, Wendell and Smith began a new large development in Overbrook on the former farmland split in half by the Pennsylvania Railroad main line. Once again, Price had a leading role in the group of architects, many of whom were also working in Wayne. In 1895, Price designed a house in Overbrook Farms for his own family as they prepared to move out from a smaller row house in North Philadelphia. This house used conventional English half-timbering above a stone first floor wall for a street elevation dominated by a large gable with ornamental barge boards. The plan is compact with rooms arranged around a living hall with a corner fireplace and an angled service wing to the rear. The ornament on the barge boards carried through to the interior where various heraldic devices referred back to the Middle Ages. These forms also appear in a large room on the third floor, denoted by on the exterior by the large windows in that gable end. In this house, Price was able to design and detail for himself and further explore the decorative and planning ideas he had been developing since he had designed Woodmont. In 1899, when his father suddenly died and he came onto a sizable inheritance, he designed a new house known as Kelty for his family just across City Avenue and about a mile north from his previous house. The land abutted the York Lynn estate, which he was also designing for John Gilmore. The plan was an enlarged version of the earlier Overbrook house with more space on the second floor for his family with 3 children now out of the nursery. The first floor had a small footprint, and the second story was carried on continuous arcades and a porch that extended over 3 sides of the house. The service wing also had grown in size. In this house, the half-timbering and decoration became more free-form than in his previous houses. The effect was more like a cottage in the woods than a suburban tract house. The giant roof contributes to this overall feeling. 2 photographs from the office album show his wife Emma and daughters Margaret and Ruth, aged 9 and 6 respectively. As completed, there was probably more decoration on the interior wall surfaces, but the richness of the woodwork and the beam ceilings is still visible. The center hall is a 2-story balconied space with a stair having split landings to serve the upper and lower spaces of the service wing and taller rooms of the main block. Unlike many other large houses, there's no upstairs living hall. The vaulted space on the 3rd floor took the place of that functional area. The most special upstairs room was this large vaulted space under the expansive roof where family or friends could gather for musical entertainment or group activities. The raised section was like a proscenium for performances, and the objects displayed in the as-built photograph hint at the idea of a medieval great hall. At the same time, Price was finishing the design for a large house for M. Hawley McClanahan in St. David's. He was an architect connected with the development projects in Wayne and would become Price's partner a few years later when they were both in Rose Valley. McClanahan never practiced architecture, but instead used his knowledge and connections in the developer and commercial worlds to bring work to the growing office. This house was a variation on ideas Will Price was working on for his own house, but had modified for the more open hillside site. Inside, the interesting plan geometry and some subtle level changes allowed for developing a rich decorative program that included gesso reliefs, elaborate fireplace surrounds, and woodwork. In these turn-of-the-century houses, Price was delivering a very complete artistic vision for clients who could afford this kind of work. And he was able to coordinate the talents of different designers and craftsmen to develop a unity in design between the exteriors and interiors of his buildings. While he was finishing the spec houses in Wayne, his work in Overbrook Farms was more different. It was more conservative. It was rooted in more old world sources, notably the English half timbering and what would be called stockbroker's Tudor. The single and twin houses did not have the variety of roof forms that were found in the earlier Wayne houses. It is interesting that while Overbrook Farms was actually more eclectic in its mix of house styles, the variety was more from historical inspirations, from the colonial revival, the Tudor revival, rather than from free forms. The earlier Wendell and Smith developments had a great variety of styles that was achieved by these different free forms that did not reference traditional styles. Unlike the works of Horace Trumbauer and several other Overbrook Farms architects, Price's houses were mostly variations on small English manor houses. When the budgets were a little larger and there was a more definite client, Price could go a few extra steps in designing these larger houses close by in Marion and Overbrook. The land parcels allowed for detached stables and a more park-like setting, but nothing like the larger estate houses on the main line. Houses for John M. Guest in Overbrook and William B. Guest in Marion were slightly larger variations on the Overbrook Farms single-family houses. They would have more elaborate stonework outside and enhanced interior features on the inside. The 1898 house for Samuel Croft in Marion is one of the most interesting of this group, with its projecting buttressed wing and octagonal tower on the left side. The plan is similar to the guest houses, but the exterior is further developed as Price is exploring the limits of elaboration for houses of this size. An interesting variation on his English houses is the 1898 Allen Reed House in Wayne on a moderately sized parcel not far from the McClanahan House. Reed was the owner of a men's clothing store and manufacturer in Philadelphia who would commission Price for a 6-story building on Chestnut Street just a few years later. The South Wayne site was on the edge of the area being developed by Wendell and Smith, but was still more suburban than country. The plan is unusual in how thin the building actually is. The footprint and second floor space is significantly enlarged by surrounding arcaded porches. The core of the plan is a large 2-story hall with a split stairs, which effectively divides each story into different zones. It is interesting that even with a porte cochere and generous porches, there's no real front door on this house or receiving area. The Jacobean detailing, inside and out, could have been inspired by books published in England that depicted the interiors and exterior features of prototypes with measured drawings. Price had also been to England to see these real houses also. In its own day, this house was considered rather showy and florid, and was the only house designed in this style by Price. Winning the competition for York Lynn in 1899 was similar to getting the commission for Woodmont at the beginning of the decade. The house was located on the Marion side of City Avenue, almost directly across from the John Guest residence, a half-mile north of Overbrook Farms. At the time, City Avenue was not paved and was more of a boundary between Philadelphia and Montgomery counties rather than a border between city and suburb. Both sides had large estates interspersed with small villages and roads and railroads heading west out of the city. York Lynn is reputed to have had a budget of over $200,000, which is almost 15 times what the typical developer houses were going for along the main line. In this project, Price would have the ability to develop his expression of art and architecture for a gentleman's estate. The exterior is actually quite conservative, utilizing all the devices he had been developing over the previous years. Quite different than Woodmont, the exterior decoration here is a thin veneer over a conventional L-shaped plan. The size of this house and its budget allowed him to develop the plan further than in his previous projects, with a generous living hall that allows for a flow between spaces that was not possible in smaller houses. The plan also contains the required formal spaces, a front door, and the reception room, a billiard room, library, and art gallery. Here are two views of the library. And you can see in the one historical view how the house flowed from space to space with these big rooms through various wood screens, sliding doors, decorative elements that tied the spaces together. So a very interesting combination of planning and decoration. The living hall still retains the Inglenook fireplace in a large archway. The interiors were the most lavish of Price's career, and with carved woodwork incorporating linen fold paneling. I have an example from York Lynn right here. Gothic details and screens and fireplaces, complementing a grand stair with its heavy carved balustrade rails. You can see a piece of that stair on the table over there. Other decorative arts were also represented in gesso reliefs and stencils by William Van Ingen, who had provided the decoration for the Library of Congress. Price was heavily involved in the designing and coordinating of the work of these various artists, including the designing himself of much of the decorative art glass in the upper sashes of all of the windows. These windows were thematically related to the rest of the decoration in their respective rooms. The billiard room had windows depicting a hunt to go with the themes in that male-dominated space. Light fixtures and door hardware were also highly finished to create an overall effect of a modern baronial palace. Custom furnishings, including some of the earliest pieces from the Rose Valley shops, complemented the interiors. The second floor was plainer, but still retained some of those medieval decorative forms in the doors and wood moldings. The upstairs hall echoed some of the treatments below, and the third floor had a large gymnasium beneath the tall, hipped roof. While we were there in school, that was known as the Squirrel Club. You can imagine what 50 years of Ivy does for allowing access to all kinds of things. In 1920, Gilmore sold the 19-acre estate to the Episcopal Academy for $225,000, and they moved from their Center City building at Locust and Juniper Streets the next year. In its final years as the upper school, the 50 years of heavy use had convinced the school that it was not economical to renovate the building to supplement the new classroom buildings at the center of the campus that they had just completed. So this building was demolished in December of 1973. Price had a few more big houses to begin the new century, including Grey Craig near Devon. It is a slightly smaller variant on York Lynn without as much decorative detail inside or the French Renaissance touches on the exterior. This house survives in good condition, although the spacious lawns that set it off from Waterloo and Church Roads have become a dense subdivision, and the 40-year-old trees in that subdivision have already made that development look mature. Some of the interiors, compare these with what you just saw at York Lynn. Same plan, same idea, but not the same richness of decorative arts. Returning to the beginning of the decade of the 1890s, there's another interesting house that shows a different side of the practice, and it's a harbinger of the things to come. In 1888, the Price brothers completed the design for the Charles Davis House in North Wayne. It was a little larger than the spec houses being offered through Wendell and Smith, but it is composed of many of the familiar elements of those houses, almost a catalog of the roof and wall forms of the various house types. 4 years later, in 1892, the J.L. Twaddle House in Devon bears more than a superficial resemblance to that earlier house, but it is different in some key areas. On the street facade, the number of different roof forms has been reduced, and the heavy trim found in the barge boards of the earlier house is eliminated. It is a clearer expression of the shingle style, where the walls are more like a taut membrane over the heavy frame construction than a heavy skin themselves. The rear facade is the real revelation, as the surfaces are further flattened and layered to a more abstract composition. On this facade, Price has both digested the examples of the reductionist shingle style and foreseen the coming of the minimalist arts and crafts buildings in England by Charles Voysey and his circle. Inside, there's a similar distillation of the decorative forms he had been working on over the years. The paneling is reduced to a grid that provides some scale to the wall surfaces and a background for special moments like the hall fireplace and stair. The newel post for the winding stair is an incredible piece of artistic design and carving, where the classical egg and dart molding is engulfed by a very naturalistic expression of the acanthus leaf. And seeing this and seeing your stair here is what really created that tie and made me see these different strands in Price's work. And we'll see where he eventually ended up. The dining room fireplace is a simple brick face with a shelf supported by beautifully proportioned console brackets. See, it's very, very minimalist, but beautifully, beautifully shaped. The house is foreshadowing a parallel body of work to the developer houses and mansions, where every so often in that decade of the 1890s, a little gem would appear amongst his other work. The 1897 Henrietta Walker residence in Wallingford is one of those buildings. It was published alongside his other larger houses in the T-Square annuals and magazines, so it was clear that he was not forgetting about this aspect of architecture in his practice. This strand of apparently modest buildings is the one that finally takes root at the turn of the century as Price leaves the design of large houses he has just built for, and those commissions for the Rose Valley experiment. So his own big, finally fancy house in Marion he lives in for less than a year, as does M. Hawley McClanahan with his brand new house in St. David's. And they both come out here for temporary quarters until they can build and renovate their own houses. Who was Will Price? As the common threads of his work in the 1890s that go beyond the application of style and outright size of buildings. Price was not an academic architect. His Quaker heritage imbued a conservative artistic outlook that at times must have conflicted with his decorative ambitions. The large houses that gave him expansive canvases to test his architectural and decorative forms, while at the same time the developer houses were more of a distillation of his primary architectural ideas. Woodmont is very much about solid exterior masses, while York Lynn is a brilliant essay on a unified program of decorative arts, with the architecture being in the background. His own house, Kelty, takes the idea of a fairy tale cottage to its logical conclusion of a large sheltering roof over a cottage in the woods. In leaving that house in 1900 and the larger house commissions behind, and returning his focus to a more basic architectural and decorative forms, Will Price had made a choice. He was not bound by academic conventions regarding the use of historic precedents, and this also seems to have opened his mind to new building technologies. He was progressive in the sense that he could see the advantages in new ways of building to achieve particular goals, chief among them making distinctive design accessible to more people, the way the popular press also brought stories to life with better, more realistic illustrations. The suburban houses, hotels, railroad stations all fit with his other ideas in uplifting society through the single tax and utopian communities. From suburb to seashore, Price employed an empirical approach to design that was adaptable to emerging building technologies like concrete, where the structure could become the true design element. The distillation of design to elemental forms and carefully placed decorative elements in some ways might be considered a precursor to the stripped forms of early modernism, but the inspiration for Price was much different, as was his intent. Who was Will Price? He was an architect who created buildings out of his head. He was a designer, he was a dreamer, and Rose Valley is a realization of that dream. Thank you. take questions, yeah, right there.
I only saw one house of his mainline houses that had red tile roofs. All the houses around here of Will Price have red tile roofs for the most part.
So did the ones on the main line when they were built.
Really?
Yes.
I'll be darned.
The nails go. The tiles last forever, but the nails don't.
I'll be darned. Thank you.
Other questions? Okay, Sue? Oh,
How did they heat those big places?
big,
That's what I said.
big coal furnace. Now, remember, everything came from the railroads, you know, how to structure a building, but also how to condition it. So steam boilers, radiator systems, these buildings were state-of-the-art. And these suburban houses were also electricity, telephone, sewers. In 1883, that was amazing. So, you know, from that respect, these young architects and the Price brothers and his peers, you know, they were on the cutting edge. You know, it was, people think of it as small, unimportant work, but it wasn't. It was the future. And the people doing those, just the big houses or the clubs or this or that, they were the ones who were ultimately left behind. Yes?
When he